Hi, and welcome to Activating the Ancient Through the Contemporary in Museums, one of the final panels in what's been a very engaging 3 days of conference proceedings. I want to congratulate and thank the team behind the conference, as well as thank you all for joining us today. I'm joined today by 5 esteemed colleagues working across a range of institutions in the region and beyond. Each one of us works directly with objects and artifacts, be they ancient or contemporary in nature, and are tasked with interfacing between the objects, the audience, and the museum to enable these works to tell their story. I'll quickly introduce myself and each speaker, and then we'll kick off the discussion. We have 1 hour of conversation between us, and then we'll have 15 minutes of Q&A. So if anybody has any questions, please do drop them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So I am Noura Razian, I'm moderator of today's panel, and I'm head of exhibitions at Jameel Art Center in Dubai, which celebrated its 2nd birthday a few days ago. We are Dubai's independent contemporary arts museum with a growing collection and a dynamic program of exhibitions and commissions. I was invited to moderate this panel in relation to an exhibition I curated at the center last year titled Phantom Limb that looked at our contemporary relationship to material heritage, one that unfortunately and particularly in our region is quite fraught. So through the works on display, the exhibition touched on memory, memorialization, the writing of history, and the weaponization of heritage. And of course, the role of speculation and imagination in relating to objects and sites that have disappeared. Phantom Limb was followed by our most recent solo show of Iraqi-American artist Michael Rakowitz, whose multifaceted practice continued our engagement with these questions. And if you are in Dubai this week by any chance, please do drop by as the exhibition closes on the 22nd. So our conversation today will focus back on the object, branching out to look at the processes of turning these objects from archaeological finds into artifacts in a museum setting, as well as the role of the curator and the artist in conversing with these objects. We'll also reflect on the last year, which has seen anti-racist movements across the world focus on public institutions and specifically museums as sites of representation and power that are in sore need of change. And even in particular, focusing in on specific objects in museum collections. So I'll quickly introduce each speaker and then we'll launch into our conversation. Dr. Peter McGee is director of the forthcoming Zayed National Museum, currently under construction in Abu Dhabi. He has a long and distinguished career in the region, directing several heritage research projects through the Middle East since 1994, and he continues to serve as the head of archaeology and paleontology with DCT. Dr. Caroline Autré is assistant professor and head of the Department of Archaeology and History of Art at Sorbonne University in Abu Dhabi, where she also oversees the Masters in Museum Studies, one of the only ones in the region. She's a specialist in the Greek and Roman eras and has participated in numerous surveys and excavations across the region and beyond. Claire Davies is the Met's first curator of modern and contemporary art from the Middle East and North Africa. She joined the museum in 2015 and has curated several exhibitions at the Met, most recently a retrospective of the late artist Sia Al-Manaji. Dr. Ege Yildirim is an urban planner specializing in heritage conservation and management with over 20 years of experience working in Turkey and internationally, and a focus on cultural heritage policy, advocacy and governance, UNESCO World Heritage and Sustainable Development. She's currently the ICOMOS focal point for the Sustainable Development Goals. And finally, Dr. Guillaume André is Chief Curator of Asian and Medieval Arts at the Louvre Abu Dhabi and involved in expanding the museum's holding as well as curating displays there. He has extensive field research in archaeology, most notably having co-directed a research mission in Mongolia for several years. So thank you all for joining me today. The first question I'd like to kick off with, and I think Claire is unfortunately not with us right now, but hopefully she'll be joining us very soon. I wanted to kind of kick off with thinking of the role of the contemporary within the ethnographic or the encyclopedic museum, and what the main impetus is for integrating the contemporary within the kind of trans-historical museum. So I think we'll kick off with Peter. Peter, you're currently crafting the content for your galleries, which ranges from kind of natural history displays all the way up to the present day, telling the story of the nation, essentially. So can you tell us more about activating trans-historical displays and how you kind of connect these to contemporary concerns, and how you might have plans to kind of integrate contemporary transdisciplinary practitioners within the museum?
Sure, absolutely. Well, first of all, before I answer that excellent question, I want to thank the organisers for having me on board, and I want to also take the opportunity to congratulate Louvre Abu Dhabi on its 3rd anniversary. So it's a fabulous event. So congratulations to Manuel and all his team. And I want to say to everyone there that we look forward to joining you soon on Saadiyat Island as a functioning museum. So to come back to the question, I think it's an excellent question. And look, we at Zayed National Museum, we have a rich array of, we will be displaying a rich array of historical artifacts, manuscripts, archaeological remains, stretching back 125,000 years. So at least 125,000 years. In fact, it could even be more. So within that collection, there is a huge difference in materiality. There's a huge difference in visual appeal. There's a huge difference in the potential stories that each of those artifacts can tell. Now, the artifacts are chosen because they fit within and they reinforce our narrative of talking about the sort of fabulous and rich history of the United Arab Emirates and the critical role that Sheikh Zayed played in forming the country. So within that sort of vast array of artifacts, vast array of manuscripts, vast array of audio-visual materials, photography, contemporary art can play a very important role. So within, if we remove contemporary art from the equation for a second, even though the objects themselves and the audiovisual material will be aligned and people will walk out of the museum with a new appreciation of the UAE, contemporary art can sort of act in a way to add to a dimension. It's in a way positioning a piece of contemporary art. For example, I'm often struck, one of the most favorite examples of this was Gormley's statues on the island of Delos in the Aegean, where he installed these monumental iron or cast iron statues onto an island which has the same sort of rich array of archaeological and material culture present. And what that did was it allowed the people to focus, visitors to Delos, because of course no one works there. It allowed the people to sort of focus on a piece of contemporary art as reflecting some of the diversity of the materials which were present. That's something which we are definitely investigating at Zayed National Museum. We see that contemporary art has a critical role. At the same time, it's not a museum of contemporary art. It's a museum which embraces all of the diversity of the UAE's history and culture going back a long way. So contemporary art can add something to that. And that's something that the excellent curatorial team that I'm working with are very conscious of, and we're exploring it when we can. We want to feel in telling a story that story is not somehow dislocated from the present, that the story doesn't end before us. The story continues to us, and the story is reimagined all of the time. And so in that sense, I think contemporary art can play a very critical role, certainly.
Thank you. Thanks for that. Guillaume, I'd like to ask you to respond as well. You know, the Louvre is a trans-historical museum, and it has a particular approach to displays as well. And you've been involved since before the museum opened, when there were some contemporary artworks commissioned, and are kind of thinking about the role of contemporary practitioners in intervening in or mediating within these displays. Can you just tell us a little bit more about your particular approach there?
Sure. Thank you, everyone, and thank you for the question, Nora. Indeed, I wanted to have a few words at first on the subject of this particular relationship between the museum and the contemporary world, and to say that from the beginning, there is intrinsically in many museums one direct link with the contemporary world, which is obviously existing, and this is its architecture. And if the institution, and particularly with regards to the archaeological museums, presents work from the past, the fact is that its architecture is an integral part of the city or the landscape, and obviously a bridge which is launched towards the contemporary field. And it's particularly the case with the Louvre Abu Dhabi. And this is actually an aspect that was thought long in advance in the project of the architect Jean Nouvel, to constitute an institution which is not only completed from the architectural point of view when the museum opened in 2017, but also in a constant evolution in time. And making this building a part of the contemporary world is of course a reminder of what the Louvre itself is, where the contemporary art has always been present. Of course, I'm thinking of the ceiling painted by Georges Braque in 1953, more recently of the one which was painted by Cy Twombly in 2011 in the Bronzes Room, the work of Ansel Kiefer, Jean-Michel Otoniel, and so on. We can give many examples. But undoubtedly, in the Louvre Abu Dhabi, there is this particular perspective from the contextualist architect Jean Nouvel, who has a desire to correspond with the fact that the population of Abu Dhabi is showing a strong interest for the field of contemporary art in particular. And then it explains probably also why there are many artworks which are included into the architecture. First, there is a series of 4 works by the Italian artist Giuseppe Pennone called Germination, which is exploring the links between humanity, art, and nature. And there is another artist which has been directly included into the architecture. It is Jenny Holzer, a neo-conceptual artist who works primarily with word and text in the public space. Through the collaboration with the curators, she produced 3 series of monumental panels which are related to the story of the museum and placed at the exterior spaces under the dome. One of them I find is particularly interesting, located at the exit of the permanent galleries and facing the Rodin sculpture of the man walking on a column. If I guess some of you had the opportunity to visit the museum. The panel bears a cuneiform text in Akkadian and Sumerian, illustrating several key messages from the museum, relating the myth of the creation of mankind by Mesopotamian people 2,800 years ago. And actually, these art commissions are indeed fixed into the architecture. But the contemporary project does not stop there. There are several specific places which have been built under the dome and some spaces deliberately left free in order to receive other contemporary interventions in the future. It is therefore an architecture conceived as evolutionary, which integrates contemporary production within the framework of the museum's narrative, and which therefore draws on historical depths. And this is what, in fact, I want to summarize in a few words, is that in the relationship between the museum and the contemporary artwork, the historical depth and the deep knowledge is particularly relevant. This is why it's necessary when it comes to commissions and to contemporary interventions into the museum to have a real collaboration between the artist and the curatorial team. And this is how we did in the Louvre Abu Dhabi, and there are other examples that we could take, of course. But maybe I leave the floor to others to react on this, and I have other points that we can discuss afterwards.
Sure, yeah. I had a follow-up question for you, actually, and maybe for Caroline as well, if she'd like to chime in. When we spoke about this panel, you were talking about the challenges of kind of bringing sites and objects to life for the public. There's so much research behind these objects. There's so much work in uncovering them, but there's also so many questions and so many unknowns. And of course, there's a lot of things unknown that we have to speculate about, etc. And you spoke about this tension between sort of uncovering sort of scientific knowledge about the past, about history, and the public wanting something more spectacular or singular when they come to the museum. So how do you kind of reconcile this idea of bringing all of that work, bringing all of that information, but only perhaps enabling to encapsulate that within one or two objects? You know, what kind of gets lost in that process in a way? And yeah, maybe you can talk about that a little bit, and Caroline as well, in your experience. How do you bring all of that richness to the public, and how do you allow a kind of open-endedness and maybe some honesty about the role of speculation and imagination in actually crafting the story of these objects as well? So Guillaume and Caroline, if you could speak to that, please.
Yeah, Guillaume, do you want to start? Oh, okay. Okay. So yeah, about the museum. Well, we are as an archaeologist, I am collaborating with museums because we are bringing the objects. And yeah, what I was saying to you, Nora, when we had our first meeting was that sometimes it's true that for us, the artifact that we're finding is of the, let's say, uttermost importance in terms of informations about the civilization, the sites, the chronology, whatever, but it might not be the most beautiful artifact. So it might not be on display and exhibited in the museum. So it is always a bit, I would say, tricky for the people. I'm not the one that is taking the call, so to decide what will be put on display. I mean, on what basis? Is it because of its let's say beauty, if I might say, the attraction that the public that's engaging the museum might find to this subject, or mostly about the information, its importance regarding to a particular civilization or culture. I think that, in my opinion, just as a visitor of museums, because sometimes I'm not a specialist of everything, of course, I think it's you can find both in museums. Objects you will find attractive, that will develop your imagination, but also objects that seem irrelevant, but finally when you read about it are very important, and that finally, yeah, you will have, when you think about it, a lot of possibilities, and it's also very good for imagining how an ancient site of an ancient culture would have functioned, let's say. So, yeah.
Thank you. Guillaume, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, there is one point also which I'm thinking about listening to Caroline, and which I wanted to bring up today is also linked with the what we call the polysemy of the artworks, and which is very important for us into the Louvre Abu Dhabi. It means that several layers of knowledge and of approaches that we can cover with not only one artworks, actually, because we are here confronting several artworks, and when you confront several artworks, and there are several histories that you can tell, and it's even more possibilities for the narrative and for the public also to present a very attractive galleries. Also, what I wanted to say is that in the Louvre Abu Dhabi, we have, and this has been probably already evoked yesterday or 2 days ago, we have an evolving nature of the narrative in the galleries and presentation. And here again, this is not a frozen museum, but rather a semi-permanent display that we have into our galleries. And then, based on the topics that we believe will become preeminent in the near future or in a more later future, we are able to adjust the narrative and the presentation. And this is exactly the same with our also new collections to come, because we have both the chance and the burden also to be building the new collection for the museum, is that we can adapt also this policy, this strategy to new topics that may arise into the society, into the contemporary world. And this is a great chance when you are building the collection of a museum to have the possibility of switching, of changing, of adapting this narrative into the narrative, into the collections, and then in fine into the galleries and for the public. Because in the end, we are at the service of the public. This is something very important that we have to keep in mind.
Thank you. I think, Peter, you had a response to this as well.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting conversation. You know, my background is as an archaeologist, excavating sites in the Middle East, and I'm very conscious of the opportunities that choosing objects from excavations have for a museum display. And exactly as my colleagues were just saying, that finding an object which can tell lots of stories to lots of different people is very important. Then there are issues of the beauty of an object. I think this is true. I think we have to embrace that. But I would only add, I mean, it's just having excavated a lot of sites, there's something that we as scientists must embrace, and then we somehow have to think of a way to communicate that to the public in a museum context. And that is that there is stuff that we find that we simply have no idea what it's about. And there's quite a lot of it. And I think providing, at the moment, that throughput of, well, it's not actually, it was the way it was in the 19th century, the throughput from excavation through to the very best of excavations made it into the grand museums. Because they were chosen because they fit well into what those museums were saying, either about their own narratives or about the colonial perspective on the world. That there's a value in choosing objects which tell the public that we don't understand everything, that there's so much we don't get. And I think it's a very rich way of communicating, embracing that there are these known unknowns about the past and about culture. And one of the benefits of doing that is that in the future, the object can be truly reinterpreted by different discoveries. And so as an archaeologist to museum director, I'm very conscious of that, of the very positive possibilities that a lack of knowledge plays in. And that was my only comment, yeah.
And that brings the question of kind of, all these objects in museum storage spaces, mostly in Europe and North America, where they never get to see the light of day, but yet they're classified in particular ways. Sometimes maybe not much is known about them. So opening up this idea of the not knowing maybe to the public allows for a more, maybe direct and honest reading of what these objects might have been, because some of them might still have a contemporary relevance somewhere, or it might unlock different understandings of the uses and relevance of these objects, essentially.
Precisely, especially within an ethnographic context, where the function of the object is determined by the immediate sort of bioethnography of the archaeologist, and that is infinitesimally small compared to the collective ethnography and knowledge that an audience in a museum has. So they can bring meaning to things which are not understood at all. I think that's a very positive and something that we are certainly exploring in the context of Zayed National Museum.
That's very exciting. Essentially handing the frame back, if we're talking about reframing things and how we might look at things differently. I have a follow-up question now. And that comes again from my own particular practice. So during the last year, when I was curating Phantom Limb, I had the pleasure of working with the collective Decolonizing Architecture on their own ongoing project, Refugee Heritage, which takes the form of workshops, publications, videos, talks. And it's an ongoing project where the refugee camp, which was quintessentially imagined as a precarious and impermanent space, although it has now been with us for almost 100 years, is put forward for inscription on UNESCO's World Heritage List. And the idea was to essentially open up this can of worms. So it's an ambitious and complex project that involved organizations, individuals, camp residents, politicians, conservation experts, to nominate the Dheisheh refugee camp in Palestine as a World Heritage Site. So as a site of memory for humanity, essentially. So this project was essentially looking to think about the deployment of heritage as an agent of political transformation, tracing and representing refugees outside the typical spaces and images of humanitarianism. So part of this view that sort of formed the project was the thinking that the structures and governance procedures around heritage and the heritage field are, as described by the artist, to quote, monumental bureaucratic structures founded during a colonial era. And so they look at it as this kind of monumental building that needs sort of tearing down and rethinking, you know, the very act, how we look at heritage, how we define heritage, how we inscribe it, how the community around these sites are then treated, etc. So I wanted to open up the floor first to Ege and see, you know, you've been working in the field of heritage conservation, urban heritage conservation as well, with different communities. How do you read the future of changes within the field of heritage that might be better able to respond to calls for a more diverse and inclusive understanding of shared heritage? And do you see there being a shift in how we understand what it means to preserve sites and hold histories, and whether there's a question in the act of preservation itself?
Right, thank you, Nora. Before I say anything else, referring to the refugee camp nomination for World Heritage, I think it's a brilliant idea, to be honest, quite provocative, and I'm sure the results are very unpredictable, so it'll be exciting to watch that, and that just points to the future avenues, you know, of what we might expect. So I'd also like to thank the organizers, Louvre Abu Dhabi, NYU Abu Dhabi, Department of Culture and Tourism, for having us here. Actually, I have very strong personal ties to this whole thing also because I used to work in Abu Dhabi from 2008 to 2012 as an urban planner in the Adach, as it was called at that time, and then TCA Abu Dhabi. We had the first World Heritage Site inscribed on the UNESCO's World Heritage List, very exciting times, and Al Ain National Museum was an inherent part of that whole process, so very fond memories. And it's nice to acknowledge that the UAE has its own museology tradition because of that, really. It goes back further back in time than one might imagine, you know. Also, the last museum that I have personally visited before COVID was Louvre Abu Dhabi itself in February, because we were back in Abu Dhabi for the World Urban Forum convened by UN Habitat. And the theme for the first time ever was culture. So my appreciation goes to the UAE government for taking the lead on that, on global policy affairs and linking culture to that as well. So I'm presenting kind of a semi-outsider view here, to be honest, in terms of museums and archaeology, coming from the urban planning field. And I find that an advantageous position, really. And I think it fits with our futures thinking, because we're opening up into, let's say, either other specializations or generalizations, lateral thinking, you know, connecting different kinds of sectors and modes of thinking with what we've traditionally perhaps been doing as specialists. So in that respect, more and more, heritage looks less like the heritage we know, less related to built heritage, built buildings and areas, but more toward people, the intangible heritage, the living heritage aspect. The sociological, political aspects are more and more crucial. And being people-centered, always having the society, the community in mind in our own work seems very key. This extends to the larger scale of human settlements, territories, all the way to the environment and planet even. And I know that we're going to speak about climate later, right? So I'll save climate comments for the next round, perhaps. And the work that I've been doing recently with the Sustainable Development Goals with ICOMOS, the International Council on Monuments and Sites, especially focuses on how cultural heritage, and that really includes museums, archaeological sites, everything, as cultural heritage has broadened so much to include everything human beings really do and pass on to the next generation. You could even interpret it as widely as that. So working on how cultural heritage, along with natural heritage, contributes to the well-being of societies and of the planet. So communicating this to communities and to decision makers, having public opinion and priorities of people representing the public, these are where the cultural heritage field is increasingly focusing on. I think that's what we'll see in the future. Let's see what else I can say. Here we are always vulnerable to the changes, more and more rapid, the crises. Cultural heritage is especially one of the most vulnerable assets and vulnerable resources that we have, but it's also a very valuable resource in terms of responding to change. As we saw during COVID, the public function that the museums, the art therapy in a way that we presented for society, and how we also have to make sure that this is safeguarded because of this crucial role it has. So it's kind of a virtuous circle in that respect. And this has to be recognized further. I think I can have a little break there. I hope that helps. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks. And yeah, it's really important to foreground the role of engaging with communities and highlighting the communities whose role is so vital in sustaining these spaces. We are joined by Claire, who came in just a little late. Hi, Claire. I wanted to loop back on the first kind of question, because I had you in mind when I was asking it as well. So I wanted you to talk about the role of the artists in the Encyclopedic Museum again, and knowing that recently you curated at the Met a display exhibition of Rayan Thabit's work, Alien Property. And this was the first time that a living artist was invited to intervene or dialogue with a display at the Met. And this, of course, happened before recent calls to kind of restructure the museum, etc. So I wanted to just hear from you, like a little bit more about the ins and outs of the project, but also, how was the public's reaction to this, and how was the internal discussion in the curatorial team at the Met? Do you think this is something that you'll be doing more and more of? What kind of conversations or can of worms did it open up for you?
Thanks, Nora, and my apologies for being late. I'm just having one of those days where I was confused about the time difference. So to answer your question, I think it maybe is helpful to go back to how the project was initiated, which was that Rayan came to the Met and specifically to the Department of Ancient Near Eastern Art because he wanted to make some rubbings of a series of artifacts that were in the collection. And this was part of a bigger project, which involved him sort of going around to different museums that contained the sort of these fragments of a relief, a Neo-Hittite 10th century BC relief from a site named Tel Halaf, located on what is today the Syrian-Turkish border. So he was tracking down, where these fragments of the relief had been sent. Some of them, it turns out, were at the Met. So he got in touch with the Ancient Near East Department. And that happened to be very fortuitous because my colleague, Kim Ben-Zelda, head of the Ancient Near East Department, was already very deeply involved in thinking about questions of collecting practices, the ethics involved, especially in part of the world that includes today Iran, Iraq, Syria. There's a lot of things to consider. So she was thinking about that very carefully in relationship to what her own department would be doing going forward and what their approach would be. And Rayan's project really connected with a lot of the issues. So it was in a sense, it was a kind of it wasn't planned, but from this spark came this really wonderful collaboration between myself, Kim, and Diane. And I think that was one of the best, sort of most interesting aspects of it, is that it really did happen in a kind of site-specific way through these long sustained conversations that we were having. And because the Met is this encyclopedic museum, we were able to place Diane's work in dialogue with some of the artifacts that he was referencing, but also a larger narrative about that site and the excavation of that site. So I think, one of the things we were concerned about initially is, what does it mean to put a contemporary artist from the Middle East into galleries of historic art? And there's this tendency, I think, unfortunately, to conflate, to sort of turn to contemporary artists from the region to explain historical events or explain the present, kind of art as foil, as political foil, or to ultimately just occlude the real contemporary nature of the work. So we wanted to make sure that really didn't happen. And I think we were successful at it. I think one of the interesting things that came out of that specific situation dynamic was all the objects in the exhibition started to become a little bit detached from a single kind of typology of objects. So you had, works of contemporary art that were also family heirlooms that were, you had documents from the Met's archive on the acquisition of these artifacts that were also now part of a contemporary art exhibition. So I think what was important, I think, in retrospect, was that the exhibition has this potential to destabilize some of these typologies and also the hierarchies in which we tend to think of them. So that's, I think, one of the things that contemporary art can bring to an encyclopedic museum like the Met, is to really sort of put a lot of the assumptions we have and ingrained kind of ideas about hierarchies of different kinds of objects into question and start to make those conversations rather than just assumptions.
Thank you, Claire. And I think the role of the artist also is extending beyond the exhibition and the display, in that a lot of artists are now thinking about how they might intervene within the sort of hierarchy or power structure of the museum itself. So working with Michael Rakowitz, he made it very evident that moving forward in his conversations with different museums, he would make it a stipulation that if they wanted to work with him, they would have to kind of take steps to either pressure, encyclopedic museums to begin restitution discussions, or they would have to kind of make changes within their institution themselves. And I think this is being reflected in the last year across the arts in general, where it's no longer just about inviting someone for an exhibition, but you have to have those conversations about essentially who you are as an institution, the stories you're telling, and how you're telling them. All across the board.
I mean, I think that speaks to a really central aspect of the whole question, which is, does contemporary art just get slotted into preset sort of categories or spaces within the museum, or is it allowed to actually be a bit sort of question the fundamental underlying logic of the structure of the museum? And those are two very different things. And in my opinion, the real work, the real interesting possibility of, not always, but I think it certainly is one of the most interesting things about, contemporary art in the Encyclopedic Museum, is that can do that. It can sort of put into question these underlying structures of the institution itself.
Thank you. Thanks, Claire. So I wanted to come back to Caroline because, thinking about also the future of museum practice and how that might be changing. You are looking at crafting a kind of curriculum on museum practice, on conservation. You have students, diverse student body, and I'm wondering how you might be rethinking some of the questions you are looking at in that master's program, or whether the students themselves are bringing in from their own experiences or desires the questions on, the definitions of heritage, the definition of what a museum is. We know that recently a new definition of what a museum should be has been put forward, even though it's been contested, to think about the museum as a kind of inclusive space that looks at society and sort of thinks about issues of social justice, etc. So I'm wondering, from your point of view, in looking at the future generation of curators, conservators, commissioners, etc., how you're thinking about these questions within your curriculum as well. You're on mute. If you could just unmute, please.
Yes, I was trying, but something else popped up. Sorry. So yeah, about the artifacts, it's I don't know, because when you think about an artifact, actually, I was going to speak about that on another question, but we are seeing the artifact itself, but with new technologies. There's a whole range of new possibilities that are also emerging for the museums on displaying the artifacts. Like, for instance, we are now acquiring at the university a hologram tablet, I think it is in English. So we intend on scanning some objects and represent it in 3D. So with the help of some let's say mixed reality classes. It's not 3D or just virtual reality, because you scan the object, and I'm going to show a movie later on about that. And then you superpose what has been scanned to the object. So to create one image from the real and unreal, let's say, part. You can display it like a 3D object. And so this might be interesting for researcher, as we might see later, because you can do analysis, you can examine the object without touching it. But it can also be interesting for the students or for the public to interfere with this, because you can really look at the object, touch it without really touching it, or will get inside the object, see things. If it's, let's say, an artifact, like what I have in the videos, a fardo, you don't want to destroy it, or like a mummy, to sometimes open it or whatever. But this, with scanning and this kind of mixed reality, you are able to study bones, working on density to actually go deeper into the object. So that might be also interesting and could be interesting for the museum, of course. Then there's a matter of cost and people working with specialists, but that's a question that students, we will try to make students work more in the next few years. So what is really an artifact, what is part of the heritage, basically? What should we preserve or not preserve, and then how to display it? Because I think these are essential questions with the transformation of the world and of museums, and the fact also, I'm talking about digital because with the pandemic we had to go on virtual. So I think these are important questions. Yes.
Thank you, and thanks for bringing up the question of the digital, because as we all have faced the last year, this pressure to kind of put things online or engage our audiences online in some way, to digitize collections faster. And this has been coming for a long time, I think, in the heritage field, where sites have been, sites that are under threat have been documented. And of course, there were several sort of issues with the idea of copyright of these sort of 3D renderings and who owns copyright, etc. But just coming back to this idea of the digital, I mean, us at the Jariel Center, we kind of shied away from putting things online, from doing things digitally, because we felt that there's no substitute for the kind of real experience of artwork in the flesh and the experience of, you know, the public in the room with you. But I wanted to just get a sense from maybe Peter or Ege and Claire and Guillaume, if you feel like, you know, is it the kind of utopia that people say it is? You know, are we moving everything digital to make it more inclusive and accessible, or are we really kind of missing the point? Is there something that's fundamentally lost when we do that?
Shall I? I think it's a really interesting question. And I think there'll be many different positions on this, and a lot of different voices in the room. And part of what we have to acknowledge that is, if we think about the digital as being a utopia, and the amazing experience of me being able to sit here and to speak to all of you, and to the last time I looked to be 82 people listening to us, right? This is a form of utopian communication. It's sort of extraordinary in itself. But what I would say to you is that all of us have a good internet connection, and all of those 82 attendees are able to join us. And so this sort of idea that digital creates accessibility is only contoured by those that have access to technology in the first place. And this is something which I think is important to keep in mind. Yes, you know, going digital is fantastic. As an archaeologist who's very interested in materiality, and as a museum director, I think nothing replaces a physical space with objects and text and explanations. I think this is critically important. But at the same time, I guess what I'm saying is that if we think about the physical space and we think about the way in which accessibility can be contoured and minimized within the physical space of a museum, we have to accept also that the same happens in the digital world. So we have a problem in the digital world. We have to make sure that accessibility is 100%. And that, to me, as a museum director, allows us to throw back into focus. And in fact, one of the things that this 9 months has brought into my mind, it was already in my mind, but in clearer focus, is the absolute necessity that when we reopen physical spaces, and that when we reopen museums, that we ensure that inclusivity and accessibility is beyond anything that we could have imagined it was before. I think this is absolutely critical. And it's almost like the transformation to this digital existence should permit us to understand that more, to understand the importance of inclusivity. And so I think that's one, perhaps, maybe this is only for me, one outcome from that journey over the last 9 months is ensuring that just as it's easy for all of us to go onto Zoom and to connect to each other, people of determination should be able to walk into a museum and connect to the narrative of the objects and the story in exactly the same way that others can. And I feel that is, in terms of digital utopia, I would rather create a physical, real, material utopian space for visitors. So that's my input.
Should I add on to that?
Yes, please.
Thank you. I actually have the same reactions that Peter showed about how there is nothing like the real site. We should establish that it should not, and it probably will not go away. But a lot of our processes are becoming hybrid. So I think we're going to see mixtures of using the best of both worlds. And sometimes it's the opportunities that digital tools open up are really just being understood and pretty endless, it seems. I'd like to touch on the democratic process, again, conditional to the access issue, the digital divide, of course. But this is something that is fast developing, especially in developing countries around the world. People have a lot of mobile phone access, for example. These can be used for open source knowledge creation, participation. I was just at this Climate Heritage Network meeting the other day, and we used Slido. I don't know if you guys have ever used the tool Slido. It's amazing on how you can have instantaneous decision making together. So it's very exciting in terms of the social interactions of our artifacts and our subject with people and their reactions, their attitudes, their decisions, but also the digital opportunity of documentation as a form of preservation now, especially in terms of crises again. And I'm going to switch to the climate question now. I feel compelled to speak on that as it ties on quite nicely. So I think the climate change crisis is something that is undeniably going to be part of our agendas, whoever we are, museum professionals included. So the climate action that the world is talking about and organizing around includes mitigation, adaptation, and dealing with loss and damage. And when there is irretrievable loss that's coming, documentation and memory, and interpretation of that in the way that digital platforms can both overlay different interpretations on the actual site configurations or artifact configurations, but also give a balanced voice to different kinds of narratives. What we've been talking about, it really does have a close link between digitalization and diverse narratives. So I think we will need to see how we use this in addressing climate action, because the knowledge, especially deep time knowledge, a lot of paleoarchaeology, sharing the solutions, and a lot of centuries old experimentation that's embodied in the knowledge of artifacts and sites and heritage needs to be presented to the whole world and in a viral fashion. We are in an accelerating world, and the UN agenda has called for the decade of accelerated action now. So that's a call for everybody, I suppose. And I'd like to talk about some calls to actions for some advocacy campaigns, but will we have another round, or would you like me to share my slide for that now, Nora? How are we with time?
Yeah, we have about 8 minutes, so you can just go ahead and share your slide. And then I know Guillaume wanted to add something, so I'll loop back to him, but please go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me open up my slide. Just a minute. I hope this doesn't cause a last minute hiccup for me. No, it's fine. Just pressing the share button. Where is my share button? Right, so here we are with my one slide of a little bit of promotion for you, just to give you some visual information on the stuff that we've been doing in various cultural heritage and policy platforms. So you see some items on the Sustainable Development Agenda, and Target 11.4 under Sustainable Cities has one particular policy heading on preserving the world's cultural and natural heritage. And at ICOMOS, we have really embraced the connections between heritage and sustainability with our SDGs working group. There is also a climate heritage network that I'm inviting everybody, panelists and attendees, everybody to explore. I've been giving the links for those below. If you can see, climateheritage.org. Arts, culture, and heritage organizations can join this network to share solutions and see, how we are addressing climate action. And I'd like to also invite you to sign the petition of the Culture 2030 goal. It's about how culture, with all its manifestations, performing arts, museums, archaeology, libraries, how culture needs to be part of the recovery, the Build Back Better, process that's being talked about. So please have a look at that and endorse the statement if you like. And lastly, there's a new initiative on ourworldheritage.org. You can see that. I'm now part of that, doing the sustainability theme. So, there's these are just some opportunities for museum professionals to venture out, out of as curious as you are. I know everybody is very busy, but it's really important important to actually, reach new audiences and be bold and ambitious, and try to take the lead in bigger discussions and decisions that are being made, because the world does need us, and they're not waiting for us much. We have to go and kind of nudge the world. So I just needed to share my kind of advocacy spins with the audience here today. So let me stop sharing. Yeah. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thanks. And for me, the question of climate, I mean, of course, the crisis this past year of pandemic is also brought about by the climate crisis. Habitat is lost, etc. There's more of this in the future, but it brings to me, in terms of questions around museum, the very question of the act of preservation. Preservation is in perpetuity. How does the impending climate crisis and the kind of temporal frame we're looking at for that change the very notion of the idea of preservation, and preserving for who and to what end? And it also opens up also the kind of ecological cost of conservation, climate, especially here in the UAE, climate control, all of those things that go into the structure of preserving collections, I think also is worth questioning and rethinking, particularly for institutions dealing in hot climates, etc. So that's another conversation. I think Guillaume wanted to add something, and also Caroline.
Yes, thank you.
We only have about, just 4 minutes before we move to the Q&A. So.
Yes, I wanted to add something on the topic of the specific relationship between the museum and the archaeological sites and the artifacts, of course. And we are speaking about the digital, but there is a very strong relationship between the museum and the site, the artifacts that are found there. And I wanted to give first an example that we are doing in the Louvre Abu Dhabi. We have the opportunity, as I said, to adapt the narrative and to include new elements, and this is really a chance, an opportunity for the not only for the museum but also for the archaeological sites, because there are two different perspectives on the sites. You sometimes have difficulty to bring the visitors. For some of them, for many of them, some are overwhelmed with visitors, but some have difficulty to bring them there. And in this respect, the relationship between the site and the museum is key to give a visibility to not only to the scientific work, but also to the site itself, and to create a strong relationship. And I will give the example of the artwork that we are presenting in our galleries in Wing 2, and that have been excavated in the site of Sir Banias in the region of Dhafra, where there was a Nestorian monastery and church from the 7th and 8th century that was discovered and excavated after 1994. And some artifacts from these excavations, stucco panels in particular, are presented into our galleries dedicated to the universal religions. And of course, this is key to our narrative and to representing a wide diversity of traditions in the ancient UAE. And what I wanted to say with that is that there is a very positive thing that was created very recently. It's a center of interpretation that was built also in Sir Banias, in the site where the artifacts are coming from. So in both places you have informations. On the site you have the interpretation, and in the museum some of the artifacts. And this is very, very important if we want to activate also the local visitors to come into the museum. And there is one question I wanted to ask to all of us, actually, in this particular situation of pandemic that we are facing. It's of course very difficult, and it's a tragedy for many of the site museums that are in remote places. They cannot get some sources of fundings that are linked with the ticketing, since no tourists are coming anymore. For some others, it's a bit specific, since, of course, there is a loss of fund, losing the visitors in the site, but there was a real problem that some of them were facing in the recent years. It's the over-tourism. And I wanted to ask to all of you if you have any any perspective on a new business model that could be developed in the archaeological sites to avoid to come back to the previous situation of this over tourism, or if after this pandemic, hopefully that will this pandemic will be solved, or if we'll be coming back to the business as usual, or if we have another model that is coming for those sites.
Thanks for your question, Guillaume, and I think it's an important one. I'm just conscious that it's 4 o'clock and we have already 8 questions from our audience today, and I'd love to get to those as well, as much as I'd love to keep speaking to all of you. So I'm going to take the questions more or less in the order that they've been asked. Some are directed to particular speakers, some are more general. There's one question, and I'll leave it up to you if any questions move you. So how do the display of the archaeological object and the archaeological narrative change, if they do change, when objects come from a recent documented excavation, or rather they are acquired in the art market or through donation or bequest or things like that? Does that affect the way the object is displayed? And maybe Guillaume or Claire, you can answer that. And just to kind of round that in with another perhaps related question, which is a little bit longer but from the same person, if the exhibition design should account for both the artifact's life in the ancient world, recorded in the origin context, and its afterlife, defined as the events surrounding the artifact after its discovery, including its reuse, collecting, restoration, looting, and later return at successive stages in its history, so that any historic moment in the artifact's afterlife crystallizes in what we might refer to as reception context. Should not the museum, being the last reception context and the vital matrix within which objects are giving meaning and legitimacy today, tell the meta-history of the museum itself, including the history of exhibiting museum objects, and is the way in which it negotiates and the way in which it negotiates and shares knowledge. So in essentially asking if displays should have more sort of transparency in relationship to the object's biography, I think is basically distilling those 2 questions together. So maybe Claire or Peter and Guillaume, you'd want to answer that. Perhaps Claire, you'd like to start?
Yes, I think it's a very interesting question. To refer to a specific example in the context of alien property, we borrowed a statue known as the Figure that was also from the same site as the other artifacts that Diane was interested in, and included that in the exhibition. And I mentioned this because the seated figure, along with almost all of the other artifacts that were found at this site, were actually bombed in Berlin in World War II by Allied forces. And they actually didn't shatter immediately, but the basalt was so hot that when the firemen showed up and poured water all over it, they shattered into 27,000 pieces. And then there's been this heroic effort of the conservators at the Pergamon Museum to put these pieces all back together. And I think they've managed to put all but something like 2,000 of the pieces back together to sort of reassemble these objects. And so when you look at the seated figure, you see an artifact that is a sort of record of this later violence that it went through, of the history of World War II, and also the possibility for artifacts to suffer damage in the West, not only in sites outside of the West, tends to be assumed. But I think that was one way in which we attempted to, sort of draw out the artifact in relationships to its longer lifespan and the many lives it's had since then. So I think, it does I think that that's definitely an interesting and important way forward in, trying to sort of fold in the more recent history of objects and rehistoricize them. And I think there's a certain, museums can sometimes obscure all but one part of the history, and to try and reveal again the rest of that history that's been left out is certainly really important as well. And the exhibition was, in a sense, two different stories about the afterlives of these objects. And you had the institutional story, and you had the artist's story and his personal relationship to them as well. So that was very much in the vein of what we were doing at Alien, with Alien Property as well. Yeah. I hope that answered the question.
Peter, would you like to say something?
Well, not really. I mean, the only comment I'd be is quite. If I was asked to speak about the importance of the afterlife of objects and the way it's being done, I would actually, just as Claire did, bring up the Tohalaf reliefs and what happened to them and the way they're being. I mean, it is quite an extraordinary story, and it speaks to even before the war. It speaks to the nature of colonial archaeology in the Middle East in the 1920s and 30s, and then to see them put back together again by the combined efforts of the recently unified Germany. It's sort of, in itself, I think that's a stunning reminder that these objects tell multiple stories and they have multiple lives. But to come back to your other question, I think, in a way, that story is the more transparent and the more compelling and amazing it is. And transparency is key, to come back to the initial question. If something is an archaeological object or something is acquired, it has to be, we are 100% transparent about it. We let it speak its own voice to the way it's situated within the museum by creating that transparency around it. And I think that's absolutely, to come back to the question, that's absolutely critical. Yeah, and Halaf is a great example of why we do that. Yeah.
Just to add one quick thought, which is, I think the seated figure, as she appears now, she's almost a mosaic of, that's been reassembled. And that fragmentary nature, those divisions are almost like a formal corollary to what the rest of the exhibition was about, and which is this sort of this reassembly of an archaeological site, the absences that are in the museum, and trying to make visible, those absences. And for me, that's really what the exhibition got to. It was a way of making legible or resensitizing visitors to what was missing from the museum in a way that, usually doesn't happen.
And the fragmentation of the past in itself is, it speaks directly. I think that's right.
Thank you both. Does anybody else have any comments in relation to that before I move on to the next question? There's a particular question for Guillaume. In regards to the Louvre Abu Dhabi, will you continue your collaboration projects with UAE-based contemporary artists, inviting them to interact and respond to the Louvre Abu Dhabi and the objects within there?
Yes, thank you, Nora. I saw this interesting question. There was a very successful project which was called Collab around the time of the opening of the museum. And we have indeed some new projects that are currently prepared in the museum and linked specifically to the contemporary scene of the UAE. It's the projects that are ongoing, of course, and we are a little bit limited, as everyone can imagine, in our move with the pandemic, but this is ongoing. So projects with the contemporary art of the UAE, and as well with the intangible heritage that we are trying to bring into our galleries. We were talking just a few minutes ago about the digital turn of the museum, and I think that specifically this is where the digital approach can give more interesting more interesting insight to the collection and to the narrative of a museum. This is when we develop new fields such as reconstructing the landscape of sounds during a particular century in the past. This is a topic of research recently by some scholars, reconstructing the smells also of the past, and this is something that can be used to give more content to the galleries, to give meaning to the artworks that sometimes have lost most of their context if their history of provenance sometimes is lost also. So this is the way that digital can bring additional meaning to the collections presented in the galleries of a museum.
Thank you. I'm just conscious we have a few more minutes, so I'll just move on to the next question. I'll sort of combine two which relate to this notion of engaging publics in the virtual sphere. So there's a question whether any of your institutions are looking at gaming or augmented reality as a way to engage publics with the collections and with the museum itself. Would anyone like to take that question?
Oh, I don't want to occupy anyone else's time, but yes, we are. Absolutely.
Can you say more?
It'll be great.
All right, thank you. Let me just go through the question, sorry. There's a question about, again, concerning contemporary artworks in the museum, and this one is particularly about the Met. What impact might have, for instance, Liz Glynn's surrogate objects for the Metropolitan if it was on display at the Met? Might it not allow telling problematic stories about provenance?
Could you just repeat the last sentence of the?
Yeah, it's about Liz Glynn's surrogate objects for the Met. If it was on display at the Met, might it not allow telling problematic stories about provenance?
I'm not sure I'm familiar with those works, so I can't speak directly to that. I will say that there are a lot of artists who engage with the Met's collection critically and otherwise. So we're very lucky in that sense that there is already this conversation with the museum and also about some of its thornier topics, thornier issues related to the museum. I think what needs to happen is that the museum needs to invest more in responding to those, questions and invitations that artists are already sort of putting forth. There's a program currently at the museum that brings in artists who are specifically involved in social engagement in the arts. And so there are some channels for bringing artists into the center of the institution to have, sort of essential and important conversations with the rest of the staff and to sort of speak to, what makes sense going forward. I think it's essential to have these external voices to be part of the conversation.
Thank you, Claire. There's another question that touches on this conversation we were having before around this idea of the singular object or the kind of spectacular object. So the question from Emily Cole is touching on the topic of beauty of ancient objects. Excavated pot shards, for example, are there any contemporary artists interested in questioning who determines the standards of so-called beauty and what is deserving of display? And I think this also touches on this idea of all of the artifacts that are also in storage in many places, and whether they get to see the light of day or not, and who gets to make those decisions. So does anyone feel moved to answer this particular question? Guillaume or Caroline?
There are some artists who are questioning the past, and not only the past, but the physical culture of that is excavated. But it's not something that we have currently into our galleries. There is an artwork from Giuseppe Pennone, which is more or less touching to this topic, but no, there is nothing of that kind for the moment into our display.
And I was talking about the beauty of the objects. That was exactly what I was thinking about torch shells, because it is very difficult to get information from. I mean, some can have beautiful paintings on, so they might be displayed for such, let's say, for whatever story they are telling. But if it's a portrait, let's say, from a non-flora, which was not decorated, then in my opinion, it will be hard to find it in a museum. And it wouldn't have really meaning to be on display. So, because it would be too difficult for the public to understand in any case. So, and it's not beautiful, let's be honest. I'm working on portraits, so.
At the same time, there are some artworks which are made in series, and we give a concrete example. We have in our collection a hoard of 2,861 coins in silver. All of them are not treasured by themselves, but the fact that it is a hoard and a series brings a lot of meaning to this group and to presentation into the museum. So we don't necessarily need masterpieces, even if all museums are very pleased to present this kind of pieces into their galleries, but it's not always what is bringing the most, it's not only what is most meaningful to a museum and to a collection, definitely.
Sorry, I have to interject as well, Nora. Sorry, since Guillaume did. Speaking of beauty and how it's subjective, I think beauty can also come from how it's useful for people's lives improvements, you know. And if you connect the stories and interpret objects so that they make more sense in contemporary everyday life and maybe help people get inspired for improving their life, that is beauty in itself as well, I think.
Thank you. We've run out of time, so I'm sorry, I'm going to have to cut any further comments and questions off, but I want to thank all the panelists for the conversation. It's been an absolute pleasure. I'd love to, of course, continue the conversation. It's been so enriching, and thank you so much for everybody who attended and asked questions as well.